Here's a number that sounds impossible. The average slice of whole wheat bread has a glycemic index nearly identical to white bread. Both can push your blood sugar up faster than a spoonful of table sugar. Not a small gap. A handful of points on a 100-point scale. Separating the healthy choice from the sugar you've been avoiding your entire life. Here's why almost nobody knows this. Modern whole wheat flour is milled just as finely as white flour. The bran and germ are still technically there. But ground down to particles smaller than flour dust, the structure that would slow digestion is already gone. Destroyed before the bread ever reaches your oven. One food. Rebuilt from 4 ordinary ingredients, already reaching your gut through mechanisms explained on this channel before. And a real recipe, at the end of this video, you can actually make tonight. This isn't a supplement or an exotic import. It's the most ordinary food on earth, rebuilt from the ground up. You've probably eaten a version of it this week. That's exactly why this matters more than another exotic superfood video ever could. Berries, salmon, even psyllium husk itself, easy to treat as optional additions to an already full plate. Bread isn't optional in most people's week. It's the default, reached for without a second thought, multiple times a day. That's exactly what makes getting it right worth this much attention. Here's what most people believe about bread. Whole wheat beats white. Whole grain on the label means healthy. That's the whole conversation, most of the time. It's not entirely wrong. Whole grains in their intact form genuinely offer real benefits over refined ones. But whole grain bread and whole grains are not the same thing. One is a food. The other is a marketing label stamped onto flour that's been pulverized past the point where its original structure matters. Here's what that label leaves out. Glycemic index measures how fast a food raises your blood sugar. Commercial whole wheat bread scores in the high 60s to low 70s. White bread scores around 75. Table sugar itself sits lower, around 65 to 68. Read that again. Bread, whole wheat included, can raise your blood sugar faster than the sugar bowl on your counter. This matters specifically after 50. Insulin sensitivity naturally declines with age. A food eaten daily, believed to be the responsible choice. Quietly working against exactly the system this channel has spent a dozen videos explaining. Bread isn't the only food hiding behind a healthy-sounding label. It's simply one of the most common ones, eaten at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, day after day. Here's the part that changes the entire conversation. This isn't about eliminating bread. It's about understanding exactly why the conventional version works against you, and replacing it with something built from ingredients that don't. There's a reason this particular gap stays hidden. Grocery store marketing built an entire aisle around the word whole. Most shoppers never had a reason to question what that word actually guarantees. That's not a failure of judgment. It's simply what happens when a label does the thinking a food's actual structure should be doing. Instead, sourdough bread deserves a separate, honest mention here. It often gets lumped in with healthy bread without much scrutiny either. Real sourdough, fermented properly over many hours, genuinely does something wheat bread on a grocery shelf doesn't. Lactic acid bacteria in that fermentation break down a meaningful share of the phytic acid discussed later in this video, in some studies by well over half. That's a real, legitimate path to a better loaf. It's also inconsistent in practice. Most sourdough sold commercially is fermented for a fraction of the time genuine sourdough actually requires. Shortcuts that skip the exact process responsible for the benefit. Reading sourdough on a label guarantees the taste. It doesn't guarantee the fermentation time behind the health claim. This channel isn't in the business of telling you to make traditional sourdough at home. It takes a starter culture, days of maintenance, and a level of commitment most people reasonably aren't going to sustain. What follows instead is a different solution to the same underlying problem. One that doesn't depend on fermentation time, starter maintenance, or trusting a bakery's actual process. The question worth sitting with is simple. What would bread need to be made from to stop working against the very system it's supposed to nourish? Here's the mechanism behind that shocking number from the opening. Glycemic index depends heavily on particle size. The finer a starch is ground, the more surface area it exposes to your digestive enzymes, the faster it converts to glucose in your bloodstream. Industrial milling grinds every part of the wheat kernel, bran, germ, and starchy center into particles finer than table salt. That processing happens whether the bag says whole wheat or not. The nutrients technically remain. The physical structure that would have slowed their absorption does not. There's a second issue layered on top. Wheat, like most grains and seeds, contains phytic acid. This compound binds tightly to minerals: iron, zinc, calcium, and magnesium, reducing how much your body actually absorbs from the same meal. It's a well-established piece of nutritional biochemistry, not unique to wheat, but present in meaningful amounts in most bread made from grain flour. Here's what a genuinely gut-friendly bread needs to solve for: a base that doesn't spike blood sugar the way finely milled grain does, a fiber source supporting the same fermentation pathway already explained on this channel, feeding gut bacteria, not just adding bulk, and a structure free of the compounds working against mineral absorption in the first place. It's worth naming one more detail before moving into the ingredients themselves. None of this is an attack on wheat as a plant. It's specific to how modern industrial milling processes it, and how that processing interacts with a body already managing insulin sensitivity, gut inflammation, or both. A loaf of stone ground, coarsely milled bread behaves differently than the finely milled commercial version most people actually eat. This recipe simply removes the guesswork of finding that version by starting somewhere else entirely. There's a practical reason this recipe skips fermentation entirely rather than asking you to attempt sourdough at home. Fermentation time, temperature, and the specific bacterial strains present all change how much phytic acid actually breaks down. Get any of those variables wrong, and you end up with bread that tastes like sourdough, without delivering the benefits sourdough is known for. A recipe built from ingredients naturally low in phytic acid to begin with sidesteps that variability completely. You don't need to trust a fermentation process to work correctly. There's simply much less of the compound present in the first place. This is worth connecting back to a broader pattern already established on this channel. Prevention beats correction. Almost every time this channel has covered a mechanism in detail. The kidney video made this point about gut-made toxins. The same logic applies here. Removing a problem at the source is more reliable than neutralizing it after the fact. True whether that problem is a uremic toxin or an anti-nutrient in a slice of bread. That's exactly what today's recipe is built around. Not a wheat product reformulated to sound healthier. A different starting point entirely. Benefit 1. Blood sugar impact, addressed at the source. The bread in this video is built primarily from almond flour and psyllium husk, replacing wheat flour entirely. The most direct reason involves basic composition. Almond flour carries roughly 10 to 20 grams of carbohydrate per 100 grams. Wheat flour carries around 76. That's not a marginal difference. It's a different food category entirely before any conversation about processing or milling even begins. It's worth being fully honest about a more contested claim here. Some sources suggest almond consumption directly improves insulin sensitivity. The research on that specific point is genuinely mixed. One study found whole almonds blunted post-meal blood sugar response in adults with impaired glucose tolerance. A more recent, longer-term randomized trial found the opposite. Almond consumption over 5 months measurably worsened insulin sensitivity in a similar population. This channel won't pretend that contradiction doesn't exist. What isn't contested is simpler, and it's what this recipe actually relies on. A low-carbohydrate flour base produces a smaller blood sugar response than finely milled wheat, largely because there's dramatically less rapidly available starch to begin with. That's the honest version of this benefit, not a claim that almond flour actively improves how your body handles sugar. A more modest claim. A low-carbohydrate base simply gives your blood sugar less to respond to. There's a practical detail worth adding here for anyone shopping for almond flour specifically. Blanched almond flour, made from almonds with the skin removed, produces a finer texture than almond meal, which still contains the skin. Either works nutritionally. The finer blanched version simply produces bread closer to the texture most people expect. That matters more for whether you'll actually make this again than any nutrient difference. That's basic nutritional math, not a disputed mechanism. Benefit 2. Feeding the fermentation pathway already explained on this channel. Psyllium husk is the second core ingredient. It's already appeared twice on this channel, in the pancreas and kidney videos. The same viscous, gel-forming fiber that slows gastric emptying and feeds short-chain fatty acid-producing bacteria is doing identical work here. Structural work, holding this grain-free bread together the way gluten would. That's a detail worth sitting with. In wheat bread, gluten provides structure, but contributes essentially nothing to the fermentation pathway discussed throughout this channel. In this recipe, the structural ingredient and the gut-supporting ingredient are the exact same thing. Most gluten-free bread recipes reach for a blend of starches and gums to replace what gluten normally does. Ingredients that add back exactly the rapidly digested carbohydrate this recipe avoids. Psyllium solves the same structural problem without that trade-off. This is worth stating directly, since it's easy to miss. Read the ingredient list on most store-bought gluten-free bread. You'll typically find tapioca starch, potato starch, or rice flour near the top. Every one of those is a rapidly digested carbohydrate, often with a glycemic index as high as the wheat flour it's replacing. Gluten-free solves one problem while quietly reintroducing the exact one this video opened with. Psyllium husk doesn't have that trade-off built in. Benefit 3. Mineral absorption without the phytic acid trade-off. Almond flour contains meaningfully less phytic acid than whole wheat flour. None of the extra compound layered on top through bran, since almond flour has no bran fraction at all. That means the calcium, magnesium, and other minerals in this recipe's ingredients face less competition for absorption. Less than the same nutrients would face in a wheat-based loaf. This connects directly to a detail already covered on this channel. Mineral absorption isn't only about how much you eat. It's about how much actually gets through your gut lining into your bloodstream. A distinction that matters more as anti-nutrient compounds compete for the same absorption pathways. This matters more after 50 specifically. Calcium and magnesium absorption already decline gradually with age, independent of diet. A food that removes one obstacle to absorbing them isn't a dramatic fix, but it's a real, stackable advantage, on top of everything else already working against age-related mineral loss. For context on how much phytic acid actually matters here, whole wheat flour contains substantially more of it than almond flour does, gram for gram. That gap compounds meal after meal for anyone eating bread daily rather than occasionally. A single slice makes little difference either way. A daily habit, sustained over years, is where a structural difference like this one actually shows up. Benefit 4. Protein and fat instead of rapidly available starch. Eggs, the fourth core ingredient, shift this recipe's macronutrient balance entirely. Traditional bread is almost pure starch. This version derives a meaningful share of its calories from protein and fat instead. Both slow gastric emptying and blunt the blood sugar response to whatever carbohydrate remains. This is the same general principle already explained in earlier videos on this channel. Just applied to an entire food, not a single addition to a meal. Protein and fat eaten alongside carbohydrate change how that carbohydrate behaves in your bloodstream. Here, that principle is built into the bread itself, rather than something you'd need to remember to add separately. Here's the detail worth sitting with across all 4 of these points. This isn't a supplement or an add-on. It's a direct one-to-one replacement for a food most people eat daily. Rebuilt from ingredients that work with the same mechanisms already explained on this channel, instead of against them. Butter, in small quantities, contributes its own share to this balance too. A source of fat that slows digestion further, without the industrial seed oils increasingly scrutinized in nutrition research today. A topic this channel hasn't covered directly yet. Anyone avoiding dairy entirely can substitute coconut oil or ghee for the butter here. The outcome won't meaningfully change. Ghee, clarified butter with the milk solids removed, is often better tolerated by people with mild dairy sensitivity. It still provides the same fat structure this recipe relies on. There's a reason this channel keeps returning to the same underlying ideas, even in a video built around a single recipe instead of a list of foods. This connects directly to territory already covered here. Psyllium's role in feeding gut bacteria, already explained for the pancreas and kidneys. The blood sugar mechanics behind fiber and protein, already explained in the context of insulin resistance. This video applies those same principles to something eaten far more often than any single food covered so far. Bread, in some form, reaches most people's table multiple times a day. It's worth being precise about what this recipe can and can't claim. It doesn't reverse insulin resistance on its own. It doesn't replace whatever specific dietary guidance a doctor has already given for diabetes or another diagnosed condition. What it offers is narrower and still genuinely useful. A direct swap. Removing a food that works against mechanisms already explained here, replacing it with one built to work alongside them. It's also worth naming the honesty this video leaned on. The almond and insulin sensitivity question remains genuinely unresolved in the research. This video didn't pretend otherwise. It relied instead on a composition argument that doesn't depend on that unresolved question being settled either way. Someone managing diabetes or significant insulin resistance shouldn't treat any single recipe as a solution on its own. This swap is a reasonable, evidence-informed direction. It's not a substitute for care already being managed with a doctor. There's also a practical honesty worth naming about cost and effort. Almond flour and psyllium husk cost more per loaf than a bag of commercial flour. This recipe isn't being presented as the cheapest option available. It's being presented as the option that actually does what the marketing on a wheat bread bag implies, without delivering. It's also worth being realistic about who this recipe is for. Someone eating bread occasionally, as an accompaniment rather than a daily staple, will see limited benefit from switching. The mechanisms here depend heavily on frequency. Someone eating bread daily, multiple times a day, is exactly who this swap matters most for. This isn't a recipe that needs to replace every slice of bread you'll ever eat. It's most useful as the default for whichever meal bread shows up in most often. If a single food deep dive like this one was useful, follow this channel. Videos connecting research this specifically to something this ordinary arrive every few days. Go back to where this video started. A number that sounded impossible. Whole wheat bread, nearly indistinguishable from white bread on the one measure that matters most for blood sugar. Both capable of outpacing sugar itself. That's not a reason to fear bread entirely. It's a reason to look closely at what any specific loaf is actually built from, rather than trusting a label that says whole grain and stopping there. This same scrutiny extends further than bread, worth saying explicitly before this closes. Crackers, cereal, tortillas, pasta. Most of the packaged carbohydrate aisle relies on similarly fine milling and similar phytic acid content. The gap between label and structure repeats there too. Bread simply happens to be the most universally eaten example, and the clearest place to start. The recipe in this video isn't a trend or a shortcut. It's a direct application of mechanisms already explained across this entire channel. Gut bacteria, blood sugar, mineral absorption, applied to one of the most commonly eaten foods there is. If today's explanation gave you a reason to look differently at your own bread, follow this channel. New videos breaking down research exactly like this arrive every few days. Send this to someone who eats whole grain bread daily, believing the label alone settles the question. Someone who has never heard glycemic index and mineral absorption connected to a loaf of bread. This directly. Leave a comment if you actually make this recipe. There's a good chance the texture surprises you in a good way, once you know what to expect from bread built this differently. This video is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for medical advice. Always consult a healthcare professional. Go back to where this video started. A number that sounded impossible. Whole wheat bread, nearly indistinguishable from white bread on the one measure that matters most for blood sugar. Both capable of outpacing sugar itself. That's not a reason to fear bread entirely. It's a reason to look closely at what any specific loaf is actually built from, rather than trusting a label that says whole grain and stopping there. This same scrutiny extends further than bread, worth saying explicitly before this closes. Crackers, cereal, tortillas, pasta. Most of the packaged carbohydrate aisle relies on similarly fine milling and similar phytic acid content. The gap between label and structure repeats there too. Bread simply happens to be the most universally eaten example and the clearest place to start. The recipe in this video isn't a trend or a shortcut. It's a direct application of mechanisms already explained across this entire channel. Gut bacteria, blood sugar, mineral absorption, applied to one of the most commonly eaten foods there is. If today's explanation gave you a reason to look differently at your own bread, follow this channel. New videos breaking down research exactly like this arrive every few days. Send this to someone who eats whole grain bread daily, believing the label alone settles the question. Someone who has never heard glycemic index and mineral absorption connected to a loaf of bread this directly. Leave a comment if you actually make this recipe. There's a good chance the texture surprises you, in a good way. Once you know what to expect from bread built this differently. This video is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for medical advice. Always consult a healthcare professional.